The gentleman you see before you, named Kumei, your average fellow who enjoys his time birdwatching when visiting Shirogane Dake Mountain. But Kumei's venture within these mountains will have him participate within a bizarre story that will leave us questioning the true intentions of a miracle. It began when Kumei heard a faint sound nearby. It was a frail man whose legs were broken, pleading for help while trying to crawl towards Kumei. Immediately, Kumei called for emergency services, and thankfully the paramedics showed up just in time. And just to make sure the man was going to be okay, Kumei joined the paramedics as they took the man to the hospital. Some of us may have stories of how our lives were spared by the acts of the divine, or a stroke of luck. But within today's tale, my friends, Kumei is about to learn that even the greatest horror can grant miracles for the helpless and hopeless. But rather than acting out of kindness, sometimes a helping hand may be the beginning of an unspeakable act of cruelty and evil. The man's name is Moriguchi, according to the authorities and the doctors. It's a miracle that Moriguchi is still alive. Traveling from Tokyo, Moriguchi has no relatives, no friends, currently unemployed. Pretty much the only thing he has going for him is his love for hiking, along with a few side jobs here and there. In fact, Moriguchi sees himself as a social outcast, or to be blunt, a nobody who enjoys his time escaping from the world. But what left the doctors and the authorities baffled, according to the mountaineering log where Moriguchi signed his own name before hiking the mountains, this was a month ago, same time when he had his accident. Question is, how is it that this man went through an entire month with no food nor water? Even though Moriguchi was reluctant to share the details of his experience within those mountains, Moriguchi claimed that he survived off of rationing whatever supplies was left in his backpack. Either way, it's a miracle that Moriguchi was found alive, and with the doctors examining Moriguchi's fractured legs, seeing how the bones have already healed, it should be at least a few weeks after corrective surgery. Moriguchi should be back to full health again and discharged from the hospital. Aside from Moriguchi being found alive, what Kumei found strange was Moriguchi's behavior, like he was on edge, afraid of something. Obviously, the man was haunted by his experience within the mountains. And even though Moriguchi was reluctant to share what was on his mind, he was thankful for Kumei finding him and making sure that he was okay, which is why Moriguchi would give Kumei an unexpected request, more like beg the man if he could stay overnight. Kumei truly felt bad for Moriguchi, found it sad knowing that this man has no family, no friends, not even a girlfriend back home. The man was a loner, and he was terrified being alone at the hospital, which may have been the reason why Kumei agreed to stay overnight. Even though Kumei was curious as to what was going through Moriguchi's mind, why was he so terrified? He felt that it would be wrong to ask Moriguchi about his behavior. Being on your own within those mountains, your body broken, helpless, and having death breathing down your neck. If you think about it, spending another night on your own can be a terrifying experience, even if it's in a hospital bed. Regardless, Kumei ended up befriending the man that night, felt that it was fate that brought these two men together, which is why Kumei offered to help Moriguchi until he was able to find a job and get back on his feet again. So what is it that Moriguchi is so afraid of? What did he see in those mountains? That night, at around 2 a.m, Kumei was going to get the answers to the questions on his mind, when waking up to the sounds of muffled slurping, like somebody was swallowing water. The room was dim, but just enough light for Kumei to see a woman on top of Moriguchi, as if she were being intimate with him. Not sure if this was a secret lover or a random stranger, but something about this scene wasn't right, especially the fact that Moriguchi wasn't awake, which is why Kumei demanded for this woman to explain who she is, rather than entertaining Kumei's curiosity. The woman just sat up and stared at him. Her features were like an imitation of something normal. She had long black hair and literally wore all black, which made it hard to see her. But the face, however, was easy to see because of how pale it was, and her lips, which were abnormally big. It was like she was examining Kumei, which made him feel very uncomfortable, and that was when she quickly moved towards Kumei, face to face, as if she were about to kiss him, and just smiled. Kumei didn't know what to do. He felt a strange attraction to this woman, and just by looking right into Kumei's eyes, she knew it. That was when she got up and left the room. When Kumei tried waking up Moriguchi, that was when Moriguchi had coughed up something that was lodged in his throat and spat it out onto the floor. It was a reddish-looking substance. Kumei was shocked when Moriguchi said that it's flesh, that the woman had been feeding him raw flesh. As he feared, Moriguchi was not free from the disturbing comforts of this woman, regardless of the fact that he's now saved and doesn't need the flesh anymore. She still comes to feed him. And knowing that Kumei would find this confusing, more like his mind trying to avoid what just happened, that was when Moriguchi finally opened up and explained what happened in those mountains. It began 7 or 8 days after he had his accident. Fractured his legs. The pain was unbearable. There was no help, and the food in his backpack didn't last no more than 3 days. Moriguchi was convinced that he was going to die in those mountains, until she came. At first, Moriguchi had felt blessed that he was going to be saved, except he noticed how the woman had no sense of urgency, just casually walking up to Moriguchi. He also noticed how her mouth was full, chewing on something. Kneeling at Moriguchi's side, as if she were examining him while maintaining her chewing, that was when she grabbed Moriguchi by the head and began feeding him. Moriguchi could feel the slimy contents in her mouth, the mushy taste of flesh and blood being forced down his throat. Maybe it was because of how Moriguchi was going through starvation. He was more shocked than disgusted. So many days without food, his mind and body welcomed the raw flesh, and after giving Moriguchi his feeding, that was when the woman began to laugh before leaving, ignoring Moriguchi's pleas to be helped. Assuming that he was visited by some crazy woman, a sick freak, Moriguchi was still in a state of hopelessness. Not only had the hunger returned, but the dryness in his mouth had made it hard for Moriguchi to breathe. The man was gasping for air, and once again, moments away from meeting death. That was when the woman came back again, with another mouthful of vile nourishments. Instead of raw flesh, she fed Moriguchi a mouthful of warm liquid. Had a thick, strong taste to it when he felt it going down his throat, running off the sides of his mouth. It wasn't until she left when Moriguchi realized that she had fed him blood. It was since that day, and every day after that, till he was found by Kumei. The woman would come and feed Moriguchi with a mouthful of blood and raw flesh, keeping his body nourished. Regardless of her disgusting act, Moriguchi wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for this woman. But the fact that the woman is still feeding him, even after he's been saved, it's unsettling. To think that his mind would consider the raw flesh as a delicacy, it was unnerving. Right now, just by looking at the wad of chewed up meat, gives Moriguchi that nauseating feeling. And it was a horrible and disgusting story. A story that does leave a curiosity. Something that's obviously on Kumei's mind when looking at the meat. And something Moriguchi does not want to think about. What kind of meat has this woman been feeding Moriguchi? Moriguchi was now under a great deal of pressure, terrified that he was going to receive another visit, which is why Kumei decided to stay another night at the ward. And once again, at around the same time, Kumei would find himself waking up to the sounds of slurping, and seeing the woman performing her disgusting act on Moriguchi, who was awake this time, but in a state of helplessness. When demanding the woman to stop, that was when she sat up and looked at Kumei. Didn't seem to care that somebody was witnessing her act. That was when Moriguchi would suddenly cough up another piece of vile content that was shoved down his throat, except instead of a piece of chewed up meat, it was an eyeball that Moriguchi spat out. Finding Kumei's reaction amusing, the woman just got up and left. But Kumei was determined to get some answers, which is why he followed the woman out of the hospital, tried preventing her from leaving by grabbing her on the shoulder. In that moment, when Kumei touched this woman, that was when her arms stretched out into a pair of giant wings and flew away into the night, leaving Kumei shocked with disbelief, trying to convince himself that he was dreaming. The following morning, Kumei reported the incident to the police, alongside with the eye and raw meat as evidence to his story. Kumei was wise enough to refrain himself from talking about the woman turning into a giant bird. Moriguchi was still overwhelmed with fear, hysterically believing that throughout his entire life he was stalked by this demonic bird woman. But things were about to get much darker when Kumei and Moriguchi would be visited by the authorities. Had some questions in regards to the eye and raw meat that was provided as evidence. According to the DNA report, the eye and meat are parts of a human being and had came from the same person, which is why the authorities are hoping that Kumei and Moriguchi would give enough details to solve this case. After being interrogated for hours, Moriguchi and Kumei gave him as much detail as they could. The authorities were skeptic, possibly because of how they knew that the two men were hiding something, which they were. But regardless, there was no identifiable victim, no leads, nothing but a bizarre story and pieces of human flesh. After a couple weeks, Moriguchi had finally recovered from his injuries and was released from the hospital. Since that night, the woman stopped coming, even though the authorities didn't suspect any foul play from Kumei and Moriguchi. They never found the woman, nor the corpse that the eye and flesh belonged to. Overall, Moriguchi was incredibly grateful for Kumei's generosity, helping him through such a terrible experience. And even though Kumei tried offering Moriguchi a place to stay and help him look for a job, Moriguchi felt that it would be best to go back to Tokyo, which would help him move on from his experience with a demonic woman. It wasn't until a month later, Kumei would receive a postcard from Moriguchi, saying how he got himself a job and a place to himself, and thankfully no mention of being visited by that woman. It wasn't until a few years later, when a miracle would reveal its true intent. Moriguchi would make headlines once again when the remains of his body were found at the peak of Mount Fuji, frozen in cavity. According to the items found near his body and the DNA, it was confirmed that it was Moriguchi. After the police released some of the information to the media, there was a great deal of confusion and controversy. that the DNA of the raw flesh Moriguchi consumed years ago was his own, thus meaning that Moriguchi had been consuming his own flesh. What was more disturbing was the journal that was found near Moriguchi's corpse. In the last pages of the journal, Moriguchi wrote how he was visited by the woman again, not knowing how she was able to find him or enter his locked room. But instead of coming to give Moriguchi another feeding, she had come to take, by biting off a large piece of Moriguchi's arm before leaving. Now that the woman began biting pieces of his flesh, Moriguchi knew that he wasn't safe in Tokyo, which is why he tried going overseas. Unfortunately, Moriguchi would learn that there was nowhere for him to run nor hide. Eventually, the woman caught up to him, which is how Moriguchi ended up at the peak of Mount Fuji, immobilized because of how the woman had been biting off pieces of his legs, making it impossible for him to escape. The final entries details the horrible experience within the final moments of Moriguchi's life, dying from the harsh, cold weather of the mountain, suffering from the bite wounds on his body, and every day the woman would visit Moriguchi. Instead of keeping him alive, she would come to take another bite of flesh before leaving again. So if Moriguchi had been consuming his own flesh, the only possible explanation is that the demonic bird woman had been traveling back and forth through time to take Moriguchi's flesh and feeding it to him in a different time. The media calls Moriguchi's death as one of the most disturbing and bizarre mysteries of all time. So many theories and horror stories as to how Moriguchi managed to consume his own flesh before ending up on Mount Fuji 3 years later. As of right now, Kumei is the only person who knows what really happened to his old friend. 3 years, thinking that he was free from that demonic woman until she had finally caught up to him. But during one of Kumei's ventures in the mountains, still enjoying his time birdwatching, Kumei is about to learn that there's an evil that has her eye on its next victim, someone she found interesting since that first night at the hospital. Enjoying the fear on Kumei's face when seeing her true form, a giant black bird perched on the tree, stalking her next victim, just waiting for the right moment for Kumei to wander in the woods and make a careless mistake that would have him trapped in a state of helplessness. And watching Kumei fall down a cliff, breaking his leg as a result, that was when the woman would finally get the chance to reward her helpless victim with the sweet taste of raw flesh. Unlike the last victim, this one is going to be more enjoyable, seeing how Kumei already knows where the woman is getting the raw flesh, and finally getting the chance to experience the nauseating effects of her kiss, the blood and flesh being forced down his throat, and knowing that this feeding, this miracle, will result with Kumei suffering a painful and agonizing death.
You'll be hearing things about blood sacrifice, death, occultic symbols, the upside-down cross, possession, distorted faces, darkness. All these things are involved in satanic worship.